It's from last night. So congratulations again to all the winners from last night. Maria Cardona, thank you for that wonderful speech and your well-deserved recognition, of course. Today we're going to talk about some legal issues that will impact all of you. I have a PowerPoint presentation. We'll make that available to all of you. In that PowerPoint presentation, there are hyperlinks to almost all of the kind of main documents that I'll be referring to. So you'll have access to new ADA rules and fact sheets and different legislation from different states. You'll be able to look at all of that as you look at the electronic version of that. But today we'll go over a few things. Probably primarily, we're going to go over new ADA rules that will impact all of your organizations, not just for video, but for all of your websites, and if you have apps that you use, we'll go over some of those things. Again, I have hyperlinks to the actual rules and the standards that we have to meet moving forward. Talk about the timelines there. And we'll also talk about state legislation. So there's been a number of states that have had some legislative efforts. A couple have been successful, which is great. A few had some initial success, but then got stalled. So we'll talk about all of those types of things. I think it's super important as we look now at the cable industry generally, where cable service revenues are today, and where those revenues are headed, how that impacts you, and what we need to do moving forward to make sure that access television thrives for another 40 or 50 years moving forward. You can raise your hand and ask questions. This is not a huge group, so I'm happy to answer questions along the way. You can play Stump the Lawyer. I'm happy to play along with that. Okay. So we'll start off with ADA compliance, and this is a topic that I've addressed with this group before, but just know that municipalities are subject to the ADA. It's Title II of the ADA. For those of you that have nonprofit access centers, I think it applies to you as well, and probably under that Title II as well. And if it doesn't apply directly to your nonprofit corporation, you're doing work on behalf of cities that are subject to those rules, and so you're going to want to comply with that anyway. So just know that the ADA rules apply to your organizations. The ADA requires you to do some due diligence to make sure that you're in compliance with providing effective communications to residents. And so you should be speaking to your vendors about making sure that your equipment is ADA compliant, and then have a plan. I know in the past I've helped some Wisconsin towns, develop a plan that reviews whether or not that town falls into an exception of the ADA rules, and if they don't, what the pricing is for equipment so that they can become compliant going forward. Okay. ADA lawsuits are at an all-time high, just so you know. With ADA, there's not a lot of good news. There are rules. We have to comply with those rules, and it can be expensive to comply with those rules, and it's important to know all those things. But to comply, and there's all these lawsuits relating to compliance with the ADA, and when you look at it, so many are related to towns and municipalities complying with the ADA. And when you think about it from a plaintiff law firm, for example, because that's where you're probably going to get your complaints from some plaintiff law firm, right? It's super easy for them to be sitting in their office, going on their computer, telling their law clerk, look up every city around Madison, Wisconsin, and tell me if they're ADA compliant or not. And then boom, 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 the lawsuits come out. So just know that that is going on. There are new ADA rules, and they just came out, literally just came out. April 24th they came out. And so we have links on this page to the actual rules, to a fact sheet, and the important part there is to make sure that you are compliant with the AA level of the WCAG 2.1 standard. And just know that that AA standard is the 2018 standard. There's actually a newer standard now that's out there, but the DOJ specifically adopted this 2018 standard. So just know that when you're looking forward 2 or 3 years now, we need to make sure that our gear and our channels, not just our channels, our web pages, our apps are all compliant with that standard. And so that includes captioning for live programming, but then kind of the kicker is audio description requirements for pre-recorded programming. And so I know that some of the vendors are still kind of catching up to that type of capability for access programming. So just know that those rules are out there. Look at the slides, click on the links, and you'll get all the information that you need there. There are some funding sources. I got most of these funding sources from Mike Wassenaar from ACM. And so he mentioned that there are some grants available through the Department of Education, through some BEAD funding. And I can tell you that at least in Minnesota, as you probably know, the federal government is distributing a large amount of BEAD funding to all the states. And I don't know exactly how much is coming to Wisconsin, but it'll be probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And then the state of Wisconsin then distributes it out as it sees appropriate. In Minnesota, local franchising authorities and access centers participated in the digital equity initiatives that every state had to go through. And one of the findings that was made at the end of that process was that there would be grants available, non-competitive grants available for access stations. And part of that funding will be able to be used for this type of compliance. So that's why I put BEAD funding in there. DHS cybersecurity, Treasury Department fiscal recovery funds, and if you get federal grants, a lot of times this type of compliance could be included in those spending. So when do you need to comply? So there's 2 dates. One is for smaller communities and commissions, and the deadline is 3 years. So from the time it was released, 3 years. So April 24th, 2027. So for smaller communities, and then for larger communities, those over 50,000 have to comply within 2 years. So very important to be on the lookout. I also put a link here to some League of Minnesota Cities resources. These are federal rules, so just because it comes from the Minnesota League of Cities doesn't mean it's unique to Minnesota. It could be used here in Wisconsin. So I just thought it was a good source of materials that you can look at and just to make sure that you become compliant. Also remember that this isn't just for PEG stations. This is for your entire city. So, for those of you that are working for cities, just know that their web pages, the apps, are all included in this new DOJ ruling and need to be complied with. Okay, that's the end of the DOJ discussion. So we'll go to legislation, and that's, to me, it's a little bit more of a fun type of conversation. because it brings some hope to me in a time where we can be down a little bit on our funding. We're seeing funding generally decline with franchise fees and PEG funding. So it is kind of fun to see other states doing some things to really save access television moving forward. And I think it should be helpful to the group here in Wisconsin to kind of figure out, is there a path that we can look at for getting additional access funding to not only keep the status quo, but to improve access funding. So we're back to that level that Mary was talking about pre-2007, where, and I remember this too, Mary, we would have twice the space, with people here. And we'd like to see that again. So first bill I want to talk about is a federal law. As ACM members, I'm sure you've heard a lot about the Protecting Community Television Act. That is a bill that will roll back what was done in what we call the FCC 621 order, the franchise fee order. And for those of you who don't know what that is an order by the FCC that said that any non-monetary or non-cash franchise requirement can be included in the franchise fee. So essentially it allows franchise fees to be deducted by those non-cash things. So, this bill would reverse that. There's also, just so you know, in case I don't get to it later, there's also activity at the FCC to ask the FCC to repeal the mixed use rule that's in that 621 order, and then also to update the in-kind rule. And so this is really relating to the in-kind rule for non-cash franchise considerations. It has a lot of support. I know ACM has worked super hard on this legislation. It hasn't, I'm not sure that it has a path forward for passage quite yet, but it's there. We have a lot of sponsors. We've gotten more sponsors this year. And so the takeaway from this is make sure, if you haven't already, make sure that you're letting your federal delegation know that this is important legislation and that you would support its passage. Yes?
Do you have white papers or something that you could provide us?
On that bill? Yeah, ACM for sure has talking points there. And what I can do, Bill, is I can reach out to Mike and get you some additional information. I may have some talking points too, maybe even a sample letter that you can use for support. Yeah, but
ACM website has a whole section.
okay, so let's talk about good news. And I was telling Dana Ann and Shannon during breakfast that I'm sorry, I know I'm with a bunch of people that are really good at video and telling stories, and then I have these super dense legal slides, with almost nothing on it. But I did put a picture here. Oh, you can't even see it because I'm in the way. Do you remember the I'm a Bill? If you're old enough, you'd remember I'm a Bill. And anyway, I was so happy with Maine because Maine actually passed something, and they passed it, and they passed something with bipartisan support, and they've done it now in multiple sessions. So over the last 5 years, they've had 2 major pieces of legislation passed that benefit access television. So it's just absolutely fantastic. So just earlier this year, Maine passed an act to support municipal franchise agreements. And again, I put a link to the new law. I would encourage those of you in leadership here at Wisconsin Community Media to reach out to the Maine Community Media Association. Tony Vigue is the kind of the leader of that group out there, and they have found a way to generate grassroots support and support from Democrats and Republicans, and they've just done super amazing things. So I put live links to the law, to the Community Media Association, so you can see, so you can have all those resources at your fingertips. What the Maine law does is, it does a lot of things actually. Doesn't address the money issues quite yet. I'm hoping that's next for them. But a VSP is a video service provider, so it's like a cable provider. And there's a law there now that requires the retransmission of the PEG signal exactly the way it's sent to the cable operator. And so why is that important? It's important because all of your equipment, I'm guessing, all of your equipment is capable of sending out high definition signals, maybe even better than high definition. And if you're sending that signal out, the cable operator in Maine now has to transmit it and not alter it. So that's huge. The cable operator, video service provider, has to provide the access channels in SD and HD. Okay, so simulcast. Absolutely required to do it. They have to work with the towns in Maine to have their programming put on the electronic programming guide. So these are all kind of topics that a lot of PEG organizations struggle with the cable operators, and all of this was put into state law. There's some franchise fee provisions. Then kind of interesting, that last bullet point is on dispute resolution. And I think a lot of people here could probably, well, you have state franchising, so it's maybe not as important, but when you're a smaller jurisdiction and you're working with this humongous cable operator, it's hard to get resolution without being spent down into the ground, right? So they're developing a whole dispute resolution process through the Maine PUC. So really great things out of the state of Maine. Next is the state of Vermont, also a success, and really, frankly, kind of a big success. Yeah, our law firm was working with the Vermont Access Group, and it was kind of interesting. The Senate Bill 181 was looking at a pole attachment fee to fund access television. Pretty unique. I had not seen that probably anywhere. It had started the year before, came into this session, had some support, but that support kind of gave way to another option, which was doing a fee on streaming revenues, streaming video. And so during the session, the bill was converted from this pole attachment bill to a streaming tax bill, and that was kind of later on in the session. That also ended up kind of stalling, but the good news is really the last bullet here. Kind of as a result of those efforts at pole attachment fees and the streaming tax fee, the legislature decided instead to provide $1 million as a line item in the budget for just access television. And in Vermont's kind of a small state. There's only 24 access organizations in Vermont, so $1 million is I would say it's a good start there. So congratulations to Vermont. Another success. So we had 2 successes, which is great. And hopefully you can all see this one. So this is how I felt in Minnesota after the legislative session. Minnesota really started to go to the legislature with some very serious proposals on solving a few things, including funding of access television. And so we had 3 different bills that were actually introduced over the last biennium. The first one was actually the bottom bullet point, which is a local digital media tax. And what that was it was a 1% tax on all digital products across the state, and it would be used to fund local access television. That was introduced in 2023. It was introduced late. It never got a hearing. Had support from legislators, some legislators, but it was introduced so late that there wasn't time for a hearing in that session. Over the course of the summer and into the fall, we worked with the League of Minnesota Cities, and we worked with the NATOA chapter called MACTA, and we developed 2 other policies that and worked with legislators and generating support during the off session. And there was 2 bills that we talked about with them. The first is what we call the Equal Access to Broadband Act, and that was an act that would give cities the authority to franchise broadband companies, and included in that was funding for access television. Okay, and specifically we had a franchise fee that mirrored what the cable franchise fee is. As you know, capped at 5%, but then there was an additional up to 3% for access television. And then the other bill was a PEG funding bill. It was strictly PEG funding on video streaming programming. So it would be a fee on streaming companies like Netflix, for example, Apple TV and the like. And that bill, the middle bill, did not get the support that we thought it might. Actually, I was kind of surprised. The legislators that we were talking to really like the Equal Access to Broadband Act. And so that's the one that we really worked hard on this last legislative session. And for those of you interested in the process, talk to Shannon, talk to Ann, and talk to me, and we're happy to talk to you. And we had a lot of lessons learned through this process, and we really we had quite a bit of success going into mid-April, and then we ran into a brick wall. But yeah, I'm really sorry, this is such a dense slide, it's so hard to read. But there's a lot of actually really good information in it. But like I said, the Equal Access to Broadband Act was a franchising bill that would allow cities to franchise broadband companies. Why is that important? That is important because your city wants to make sure that the broadband companies that are serving their jurisdictions are serving the residents the same across the board, right? Everybody gets service, everybody gets the same quality of service. Local franchising is a way to get there. I've used cable franchising in the past as a way, as an example of how that has worked in the past. Again, we had franchise fees in there that mirrored the cable franchise fees, plus that 3% for access television. And I can tell you, we had a lot of support, and a lot of support in particular for access television. You would be surprised. Some of the lessons that we learned was that our legislators, sometimes our municipal officials, don't know how access television is funded at all. And so when you start having conversations with legislators, they're surprised. They're like, what do you mean? We fund public television. Well, okay, maybe you fund PBS, right? Maybe you fund public radio. But that is not access television. We're funded a different way, and we're having issues. And and when you talk to legislators, a lot of them came from city governments that have dealt with budgeting. They understand that when your revenue is falling, there's a problem that needs to be addressed. So I think they really caught on. And because access television touches those legislators, touches those municipal officials when they're in office, they get how important you are. And like I think Mary said this yesterday, newspapers, local newspapers are dwindling, right? I'm sure you've seen it. And so when you're looking at actually access to your government and what's going on in your communities, it's access television that's doing it. It's you guys. And that's true in smaller jurisdictions, and it's true in larger jurisdictions. I can tell you, I can pick up in St. Paul, I can pick up the local newspaper, which is the Pioneer Press. There's almost no local stories, really. It's almost all national stories. I can watch the local NBC News, and it is more and more national stories that they're just piping in. Less and less local journalism. Local government or local access channels is bringing that connection to all of your residents, and we need to be funded. And they heard that. We had multiple hearings in the House of Representatives. We had the Commerce Committee. There was 2 hearings there. The Commerce Committee put it in their policy omnibus bill, passed it out of committee, and went to the House floor. State and Local Government Committee also heard it. They were ready to put it into their omnibus bill. Unfortunately, the broadband industry brought out an army of lobbyists. So they had one day when it was killed, 22 lobbyists, and they probably spent over $500,000 to kill the bill. So I think this was a good start. As many of you know, if you're in the kind of the legislative realm, you usually don't get a bill passed on your first try. And this was a hell of a first try for Minnesota. They had really good success, a lot of lessons learned. I think the challenge moving forward is how do we get bipartisan support? So we had a lot of Democratic support this last session, which was great. Minnesota, by the way, has a Democrat House, Senate, and governor. So it was important that we have Democratic support, but it's also important that we get that Republican support and the moderate support, because that's where we ran into some troubles. So we'll be working with that in Minnesota. Put a bunch of links here. Again, you can go to those links. You can read more about it. You'll see what the industry had to say about the bill. They hammered the fees. They're like, this is a slush fund bill and nothing more. And so, we were learning on how to best address that. And we'll have some better answers this next session. Okay, state of Connecticut. They came pretty close this year. And I think I gave a presentation here maybe a couple of years ago. And in Connecticut, they ordered a study on access television. And that study was released at the end of last year. Again, I have links to all of that in here. So I have the link to the act creating the study, and then the report that was released here at the end of the year. And that report then was used for legislation in 2024. And so they had a lot of support. It got all the way to the floor again. And you can see here it was to fund access television through streaming. And it had a lot of support, but it did ultimately stall. So I have links to the bills. You can click on status. You'll see, exactly what happened. Their session ended May 8th. Trying to remember the person's name from ACM member. Pua? So she's a good person to connect with to hear what Connecticut did. They were so close. They were in the running all the way to the last day of the session. That's how close it was. Yeah.
Just a thought, and instead of, creating bills for access, couldn't there be something more simplified if we're dealing with HD, just to say it's required that any cable operator serving the state franchise carry all their channels to HD, or like you said, is transmitted to the cable operator? Because I think everyone thinks, well, yeah, Charter has everything on HD because HD's been around for 15 years, so people probably don't realize that they're still playing HD or SD from the 80s, on their upper tiers. And people are paying money for that. So.
Yeah. So what was going on in Maine was Charter was refusing to upgrade their. I always get encoders and decoders mixed up, but they were refusing to upgrade encoders. So while the PEG stations were capable of sending out HD PEG signals, Charter wasn't upgrading the encoder, so it was impossible. If you sent an HD signal to Charter's encoder, your station would go dark. And the legislature, we also got an Attorney General's opinion in Maine. I do some work in Maine as well, and testified in favor of the bill. They recognize that, and they put that in that Maine bill. So the answer to your question is yes, that would be something that you could consider here in Wisconsin, for sure. Yeah. Okay, Massachusetts had a PEG funding bill. They had kind of an interesting bill a while back where it had a fee on streaming, and then it kind of did like 1/5 to the state, 2/5 to local governments, general fund, and then there was an access piece. This session, they changed it to having a PEG Access Facilities Revenue Advisory Board, and that they put a requirement that they report every year, basically to the Department of Revenue, and recommending a special tax to fund access television. So it was a new model in Massachusetts that was brought forward really towards the end of this last session. This is pretty new information for Massachusetts. Actually, when I started preparing my slides for this presentation, I had a totally different setup because that just came like end of April. It's in committee. It's had some success. I'm not sure that there's a widely held belief that it's going to pass this session, but it's still alive. I think Massachusetts session goes until June, and so we'll see what happens there. But that's how Massachusetts decided to move forward. Okay, so New York, I think, is one of the last states that I'll cover. Again, I have links to all the bills. This has a tax on satellite and video streaming services, and this kind of has the old Massachusetts approach, where they had 1/5 going to the state for administration purposes, 2/5 to municipalities generally, and then 2/5 going to community media organizations. So this has been in the works again for a couple of years in New York, and I'm not sure that it has. At this point, it's stalled. So a lot of supporters, but it just hasn't moved the needle enough to get get moving. Okay, so Wisconsin. So I put this slide up because just to kind of get us thinking about, okay, well, what kind of bills are out there that maybe you can think about working with others on, and maybe there's a hook where you can get into a broadband bill, but then add on access, specific access television funding. So I saw this broadband bill. This was kind of like a bill that kind of mirrors, I think, what the FCC has been doing for having broadband information out there so that you can know, so subscribers can know exactly what they're getting with their broadband speeds. That bill failed in April, but it's a bill that's out there that it might be worth looking at, might be worth look at talking to the people that were behind that bill, because my guess is it's going to come back in some form next year. I don't know. Then this Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, you may have seen this. This just came out on May 10th, so about a week ago. This came out, and this is a special fund to build out rural areas of states. It's federal funding, and Charter indicated it's pulling out of the RDOF funding, and that was put in this public notice, and I have a link to that as well. So I put that in there so that when you're talking about these kind of bigger picture issues here in Wisconsin, you know that there are areas of your state that need funding for bringing broadband out to them. Broadband gets eyeballs, broadband gets interest. It's a reason why I think that, if you're looking to try to advocate for access funding, that might be a vehicle that you can hook onto for success in the future. Okay. So over the last couple of years, there's been a push to exclude streaming revenues from franchise fees. Just be aware of that. Make sure that you're paying attention to what's going on in Wisconsin. I'm not exactly sure how or who looks at the franchise payments, but just know that there's been some of this legislation out there that has been a cause for decreased or possible decreased franchise fees. Okay, so that's my state legislative update. And hopefully you agree with me, there's some hope there. There's some hope. And I know that for those of us who have gone through the battles, it can seem, it's hard to be optimistic, right? But I'm just going to encourage you, we have to be optimistic, and we have to do something to make sure that access television is properly funded moving forward. Okay. FCC update. That was my own picture of the FCC, by the way. So there's a few things going on. 621 advocacy, that's that cable franchising order that the FCC issued back in 2018, but there was litigation that went through 2022. And there are things that need to be done related to the mixed use rule and the in-kind rule related to that. The FCC released new digital discrimination rules prohibiting digital discrimination. There's some new rules on all-in cable pricing. And then this just happened, the reclassification of broadband as a Title II service. So just wanted to let you know that our firm is working with local governments from across the country. We have folks from, I think, Vermont to Hawaii doing this type of advocacy. And we're going in, we're talking to FCC commissioners and their staff, about making sure that they conform their rules to what the Sixth Circuit said in the 621 litigation on that 621 order. So we're asking for the elimination of the mixed-use rule, which said that that local governments could not regulate any non-cable services provided by a cable provider, and also that in-kind rule that says that non-cash considerations are part of the franchise fee, so allowing cable operators to reduce their franchise fees. Put some links in there again on the letters that we filed, some articles that relate to that. Digital discrimination. I know it's hard for your organizations here in Wisconsin to participate in some of these things, but I do think it is important to at least try to participate in some meaningful way in these proceedings. And I know at times the Wisconsin Community Media has been able to join some of these proceedings, which has been great over the years. But local governments participated in this, and I can tell you when Shannon and I were talking to legislators up at the Capitol, and we were talking about why it's important to allow local governments to franchise broadband. This was used as one of the examples as to why. And it shows why it's important to participate in these proceedings. Local governments urge the FCC to adopt rules that would prohibit digital discrimination. And when you look at the record, local governments were the only entities in the state of Minnesota that were urging for the adoption of digital discrimination rules. And when you say that to legislators, it does make an impact, I can tell you, okay? And so, and the FCC largely followed our comments and reply comments, which we were very pleased about. Same thing with the all-in cable pricing. Again, local governments urged for all-in cable pricing, meaning a cable operator can't say the cost is $20 a month and not tell a potential subscriber that, oh, by the way, there's a regional sports fee, there's a broadcast fee, there's an HD technology fee, there's $100 more of junk fees. And so again, local governments, and only local governments really, went out and I'm talking about in Minnesota and in other states, it was local governments that were arguing for the support of adopting of those types of rules. So, and again, links to the rules, comments, reply comments. FCC broadband reclassification. So again, this just happened. It just happened at the end of the month. Rules were just recently, the final rules were just recently released, and they haven't even been published yet that I know of. So I haven't gotten that update yet anyway, if they have been. So what's important about that is our concern was, will local governments be preempted from regulating broadband at all? And obviously that would impact some of these bills, right? Some of these bills were arguing for franchising of broadband companies. And we were very pleased, well, reasonably pleased anyway, that the FCC, I think, kind of went out of their way to say that there still is a role for local governments. It's important for local governments to have this dual federal state type of role to be an enforcement mechanism for their rules on broadband. And I think there is a place for local governments still in the broadband space, even with the reclassification. So it's an important rule. The order, by the way, and I did put a link to the order. The order is like 500 pages, just so you know. And no, I haven't read it cover to cover. Okay. So a couple of things on this slide that I really liked is, one, it addressed a specific California Internet Consumer Protection Law and saying that that was not preempted. So I think that kind of gives you the idea of the fact that there still is a role for local government if we get that role through state legislation. State and local government enforcement is supported. They have really strong language about that. And then this last one, I highlighted in red, right? Affordability program is not rate regulation. And the reason why I highlighted that one is, when you're talking about possible legislative solutions, when you're talking about making sure there's funding to build out to rural areas, that's important. And that gets a lot of head shakes up and down. And from more than just Democrats. You'll get Republicans to put their heads up and down too. But this affordability piece can also get a lot of head shaking up and down. And for the FCC to come straight out and say that's not rate regulation, because I guarantee you, because I know from experience in dealing with cable operators will say you cannot, under any circumstances, have any low-income discounts required of us. That's rate regulation, and you're prohibited. Okay? The FCC says that's not true. So that, to me, that was a huge statement in that reclassification order. The FCC current chairwoman has indicated that she's not inclined to apply basically cable regulations to streaming companies. I think that's pretty consistently been her position. So we shouldn't expect, the FCC to require the same rules of streamers as cable operators. I don't think this is my picture. Could have been my picture. I don't know. That's of the Supreme Court. Okay, so in the past, I think I've come here and given you updates on, can we get franchise fees, cable franchise fees from streaming? There's been a lot of cases that cities have brought across the country where they sue Netflix, maybe Apple TV, Prime, to say that basically that those operators that ride on top of or ride, through the public internet, that they should be cable operators under their state laws. And pretty much all of that litigation has failed. Okay, so, but what I think is important about that, so they basically fail, in my view. They largely fail because the companies that they're talking about, Netflix and others, don't have a presence in the public right-of-way. Charter has a presence in the right-of-way. Comcast has a presence in the right-of-way. The other cable operators in your jurisdictions have a physical wire and other facilities in the right-of-way. Netflix doesn't. And I think that's primarily the reason why that legislation has failed. But the reason I show these kind of are the most recent cases. And Lancaster said, they have a special law in California called DIVCA. And the court said, it's not up to us to decide if these companies need to get a franchise. It's up to the California PUC. So they kind of punted it. The East St. Louis case versus Netflix did a kind of exactly what I said. They're like, no, these companies don't have a presence in the right-of-way. They're not a cable operator or video service provider under Illinois law. But I think the important thing, and the reason why I highlight that last bullet is, and it's kind of a nuanced provision, is the court has not addressed in any of these cases, it has not addressed whether a cable operator, a known cable operator, is providing a cable service when it provides its own video streaming products. So for example, Charter owns Zoom, is it Zumo? They own a company called Zumo that does streaming, okay? Comcast owns multiple products that do streaming. So they own Peacock, they own Flex, they own Zumo, and I can't remember what else. But so my point is, when you're looking at the definition of cable service, and it's important because that's what you get your franchise fees on, is on cable service, right? And that's true in Wisconsin just as it is everywhere else. The cable operators are paying on cable service. And the position of the cable operators is none of the streaming video programming that they provide are cable services. They're data or something else, okay? But when you look at it, and when you look at the federal definition of cable service, and I put that up here. So this is the straight out of the Cable Act. Cable service is video programming or other programming. So when you're looking at a cable operator selling and providing streaming video programming, and they're providing it over their cable system, and this definition is technology agnostic. It doesn't say video programming except video programming provided through some sort of streaming mechanism. It doesn't say that. How is that video programming not a cable service? I think that's one of the kind of the biggest issues when we're looking at cable regulation that we're looking at today. So just wanted to bring that to your attention. Oh, and just to give you an idea of the kind of money that we're talking about, Comcast, like I said, owns Peacock. Peacock makes $10 per subscriber, okay? And that's per subscriber per month. So if you look at your cable subscribers, and you're in a Comcast jurisdiction, for example, you can just do rough math. Just assume that the Peacock subscribers equal your cable subscribers. It's probably more, by the way. And you take that times 10, times 12, times 0.05, 5%. And that's how much local governments are losing in franchise fees by excluding streaming video programming. I can tell you, it's a significant number. And I don't think this kind of a chart is really news to you. This is as exciting a slide that I have in my deck, by the way. So it's all negative, right? This is from a franchising authority in Minnesota who will go unnamed. But I think it's the trend that we're all seeing, right? We're seeing franchise fees and PEG fees declining, and that's a good example of it. And this is the change in revenue per year, and you can see it's down to minus 12% in 2023. So the revenues are going down. My encouragement to all of you is to really start looking at ways, and there's probably multiple ways, and so Wisconsin's going to have to find the Wisconsin way. Minnesota's working on the Minnesota way. They may be different, but the goal is ultimately the same, and that is to save access television by making sure it's funded for the next 50 years. So my takeaways from today are plan for the new ADA rules. We got 2 or 3 years to make sure we're in full compliance. Look for ways to fund it, including that BEAD funding, okay? And then, really dig into these legislative proposals that are going around in these different states, and start to formulate what might work in Wisconsin. And even though we may have an uphill battle, even though it's right to be pessimistic, but have a little bit of optimism in there too, right? Because we need a little bit of optimism so that we can keep moving this thing forward. And educate. So develop your talking points. Why is access television important? What's happening to access television? And why is it important to keep funding access television? And then start educating people. And that starts at the city level. Your city has to know what's going on and why it's important. Again, when I talk to city managers and city council members, if they are brought aware that the budget is changing, they typically want to work with that and figure out ways to develop solutions. Work with your League of Cities. I think that's critical. I mean, in Minnesota, I think that was just absolutely critical. We went into the League of Minnesota Cities, we presented to their committees, we showed them exactly why this was important for broadband franchising purposes and for access television funding purposes. And we got a lot of head shaking going on. They said, yep, we need to change our policies so that we can support the Equal Access to Broadband Act, we can support dedicated access television funding. Work with other city associations. I'm not sure what all of them are. I think I looked up the Wisconsin City County Management Association. That might be one of them. And then any other organizations that you can think of that are going to be helpful ultimately to your positions. And then make sure everybody's on board, and then develop your options. And in Minnesota we developed 2 or 3, I think, pretty good options, and then start talking to legislators. Continue to participate in these in your ACM national and ACM chapter meetings. It's absolutely critical to keep that conversation going. There's no question about it. And then when you're ready, start talking to legislators. And I can't tell you enough, that planning has to start now, because the summer will go by like that, and you need to be really prepared to have meetings starting in the fall when school goes back in. You need to be ready to start having those meetings, developing that support so that when you go into the legislative session, you're ready to go. You got a bill that's ready, you've worked with the revisor's office, you've got a champion. That's a lot of work to do. But it can be done. And Minnesota's showing it can be done. Vermont's showing it can be done. They have a little bit of a head start on Wisconsin right now, but Wisconsin's not alone. I mean, there's 40 other states just like Wisconsin that is in the same boat where they need to do something. And my encouragement to all of you is get your heads together and come up with a plan that works for access television moving forward. That's my presentation. Thanks for listening. Sorry if I went over. I don't know if I did, but thank you.